The disgusting language used by police officers in the aftermath of the stabbing of two university students in Nottingham last year has now come to light. As the incident unfolded, one officer messaged colleagues on a WhatsApp group saying, "So two students on Ilkeston Road have been proper butchered. 4 section officers turned up and tried to hold their inners in. Suspects then made off and attacked a man in a car on Magdala Road and stabbed him to death." It's absolutely horrifying. I'm joined now by former Detective Superintendent Shabnam Chaudhry. Shabnam, thank you very much indeed for joining us. I know you've spoken about this many times. I suppose the first question I would ask you is there any way that, as a serving police officer, this can be excused? Because, you know, I've worked in newspaper newsrooms where, you know, black humour has been a thing sometimes that kept a lot of people going. Things get said which you wouldn't want other people to hear. The advent of WhatsApp has probably made this an awful lot worse, because it might be that police officers would say things to one another but nobody would ever hear them. You know, now that we see it written down, it's always that much worse, isn't it? But is there any excuse? Can you give me any excuse for people under intense pressure to talk like this about these kinds of things?
Good evening, Graham. Absolutely not. There's categorically no excuse that I can think of. What I could say is, if you had a situation like this and you've got a number of officers that have attended a scene, I could understand if they'd sent messages amongst themselves to say, "I've just been to a terrible scene of a murder," or whatever the situation is, and I can't imagine how the family must feel. I totally get that.
Yes.
But this is about officers, you know, using awful language to describe a scene that they just don't get it. The fact is, if that WhatsApp group comes out, it could actually be used in evidence in court. The families get to find out. They go through the trauma time and time again because officers have been completely and utterly insensitive. There isn't any excuse. Actually, I've been looking at a lot of what's going on social media here today, and there's officers, serving officers, that are saying this is dark humour. This is absolute rubbish. This is not dark humour. It's insensitive towards the families and to other members of the public.
Yes.
I don't get it sometimes. When you look at what's happened previously with the Wayne Cousins, Charing Cross WhatsApp groups, you had Bieber Henry, Mina Smallman, where their photographs were used and selfies taken. Absolutely terrible. You'd think that over a period of time, officers might learn from this, but clearly that's not the case.
And do you think it tells us something about the state of the workings, I suppose, of the constabularies up and down the country? Because it does seem to be pretty widespread. You know, you've obviously worked inside the system. Did you notice that was going on when you were in it, or is it something relatively new?
Well, remember, things have changed over decades. I worked in policing for over 30 years. And so you see a lot more on telephone, on photographs, on social media. We didn't get all of that. There was banter, but honestly, genuinely, I don't recall. And there may have been some terrible situations where people just made some really derogatory and inappropriate comments. But unfortunately, because it's not documented, you probably didn't get to see it and you won't necessarily remember it. And I think what has changed is the whole of society revolves around social media, telephones, WhatsApp groups, and so all conversations, dialogue are exchanged through these types of messaging groups, and people think that they can have these conversations because they're never going to be played out in a private, in a public domain. Police officers are police officers 24 hours a day, and language matters. I do genuinely get why police officers might be distressed about situations. They face absolutely horrific situations, but that does not mean to say that they have banter at the expense of victims and the general public.
No. And what do you make of the news that Emma Webber, Barnaby Webber's mother, who of course was one of the two student victims that night, that terrible night, she's written to some members of this WhatsApp group and asked to meet them, and that's been refused, apparently. The force has rejected that request, which I find slightly puzzling. What do you make of that?
Yeah, that's really interesting, because one of two things have happened there. The force have just point blank rejected that offer, or the officers have actually said they don't want to do that, which is they're entitled to do that. But what I would say to this is, it to take for that woman to have to write to that WhatsApp group. If that was me, I know, and I have got a lot of heart, even that can be hard in many situations, I would find some moral compass and decency within me to say, I can't let this letter go. I either need to respond directly to this mother, to this woman that has lost her son, because actually what I did was terrible. And I do need to let her know that I will never, ever do this again. I've learned from this and I'm really, really sorry. And I think that's terrible. I'm ashamed of actually the chief constable for coming out and saying some elements were distasteful and inappropriate. I'm sorry, the whole thing was absolutely terrible. And that's shame on that organisation. Let's not also forget that Nottinghamshire Police are still sitting in special measures. So that speaks a lot about the organisation itself.
Yeah.
There needs to be a better openness and transparency. They also didn't tell the families that they were investigating themselves when they eventually referred themselves to the IOPC. So basically marking their own homework. There's a lot of things within that organisation and others across the whole of policing in the UK where there's a lot of things that need to change in terms of the way they deal with the public, they build their trust and confidence, because this does nothing to build bridges within communities and within families of victims that are totally traumatised.
Well, exactly. And it also takes the focus away from the crime itself. And the other problem with this particular individual who was found guilty or who pleaded guilty to manslaughter and who may in fact be released from prison or from a mental institution, if you like, because he may be judged to have been OK again at some point. The family have also been very upset about that. But this also shocked me today when I read this, that Shropshire fire chiefs have found a similar kind of level of WhatsApp messages being passed around in which several fire chiefs said that they wanted to kill female colleagues. They talked about them in phrases like lazy cow, bint, useless. I mean, it's beggars belief that in 2024, not only would people think that, but they would actually write it down.
Well, there's a couple of things that have come out of that. I've worked with fire services across the UK. I've been in and done a number of presentations around misogyny, racism and sexism and so on. And I've spoken to many officers. I've spoken to many female officers, particularly in the last few weeks, where this has been coming out, who are actually really scared now. And it's not just in Shropshire fire services. This is across the fire services, because when you've got the most senior fire services, the chief officers having conversations like this, what does that tell you about the rest? These are the officers that are supposed to be leading by example. So when you've got officers, whether it's female or male, and in the main, we're talking about female here, who want to report or incidents or misogyny or sexism or racism to their senior officers, and they're being protected by those at the top of the tree. These two disgraceful fire chief officers need to resign, they need to be investigated, or they need to be sacked.
Yeah, I think that's probably the only way we can go on this.